Cool, and so we're pressing forward. The objective for now is to add a listing of all of the individual advertisements for the houses that we want to have posted on Collabo. And from our original design way back at the beginning of this exercise, we want to have these images in a Pinteresty style layout kind of cascading all along this area. So when we open up our code, we have our column LG9, that represents this 3/4 area. And what we can do is we can actually define a grid within a grid. And that allows us to make really complex layouts really easily. So what we want to do is we want to create a row. Now, to create 3 columns within this section, we have to treat this section as though it's a full width container. And so within a full width container, you can have 12 possible columns. Even though its container is 9 columns, that's 9 columns within the broader container, this huge thing here. But if I'm within this 3/4 space, I now treat that as the 100%. So if I want to have 3 columns here, they each need to be of width unit 4. Oops, I'm closing too many tags. So I want to just kind of copy and paste that. And in fact, I'll add a text paragraph to kind of demonstrate how the columns are going to work. So if we add these 3 columns, we're going to get these 3 results, and you can see they're already very neatly arranged. But for our purposes, while we're still working on the individual element, let's keep it to 1 column. Let's keep that empty. So let's refresh to make sure that we're, moving things along here. Now, everything kind of starts with an image. We know that we're going to be working with some sort of specific section. That's probably going to contain a lot of other types of information besides just an individual image. So it would probably be best for us to do first 2 things. One is to wrap it around a thumbnail to make sure that the image fits the full width of its container, this full column. And we probably want to wrap that, or we want to add an additional class called home listing so that we can apply additional styles on top of it to its contents in a specific way that doesn't affect any other thumbnails on the page. We're going to include the house.jpg image as a placeholder, and let's see how that looks. Looks pretty goose hint. There's Yanukovych's house, as we can see it up there. So we probably want to add some sort of title. Let's add a small title that's the address. Cool, it adds it at the bottom here. Now, what happens is our goal is to have the text on top of the image. This has UI trade-offs. For example, some text doesn't work on top of all images. But just to kind of demonstrate the flexibility of HTML and your layouts, we're going to proceed with this. So what we could have done in a lax way is we could have actually put this H4 before the house, centered it, and then added some additional information, and it would have worked pretty well. The thumbnail would have worked out, and everything would have been really, really kosher. But we don't want to do that. We want to have the text on top of the image. So the one way we want to do that is put that somewhere in here. It needs to be on top of the image. And the way that it's positioned now is it's positioned relative to, first of all, the elements around it, so this image, as well as the elements that it's inside of, including this thumbnail. And it's positioned relatively. What I want to do is I want to position it absolutely. So what if I use this position absolute property? What happens then? Well, the text now falls outside of the thumbnail, but it's still contained within it in the HTML. If I add another element called top equals 0, it's going to say put me at the top of that container. You don't necessarily have to wrap around me, but it's going to wrap around whatever is not positioned absolutely. It's going to wrap around whatever is positioned relatively, which is this image. But we want this text to still be inside its container, which is to put it at the top of it. Let's make this text span the full width of its text box. And if I refresh that, nothing really changes because we don't really see the width. It's not going to stretch the text, it's just going to stretch the box that it's inside of. And if I go here, you can see that the box is actually outside of the thumbnail. That's because the thumbnail container isn't really explicitly defined as something that's positioned relatively. So whenever you position something absolutely, you want to make sure that its container is positioned relatively. So we want to position the home listing, the container, as a relative element. And if I refresh now the H4 is actually within the thumbnail. And I can do cool things. For example, I can make it text align to be center. Cool, and I can make that text to be color white. Neat. Now I also might want to add some CSS drop shadow. Now I'm not particular expert on this because it's a relatively complicated CSS rule. So I'll look for the CSS text shadow property. What it basically says is how much shadow do I put on the right side, and I think it's the bottom, the horizontal shadow and the vertical shadow. So if I want to add text shadow to this element, I use the text shadow property. I want to add, let's say, 2 pixels both ways, and I want it to be, I think it's FFF, which is the hex code for black. And does that work? It adds a white text shadow, so that's kind of interesting. 1, 2, 1, 2, 3. So 0, 0, 0 is black, and so that creates something interesting. I think 2 pixels kind of creates a little comic-y effect, so maybe 1 pixel will be sufficient for making it kind of blend out. So again, the UI trade-off is still there. It's still a little bit hard to read, so maybe you're best served either adding some kind of background, maybe you're better off adding a background color of black. See what happens if we add a color background of black. Okay, it creates this kind of stuff, and additional adjustments would have to be made to kind of make sure it falls within the thumbnail. But for our purposes, we're going to stay with the text shadow. So now we kind of get this whole position absolute deal. Let's keep experimenting this and adding different elements to position them all around this canvas, this little image. So we might want to have a little price. I added a class because we're going to apply a position absolute on that. So let's call this 600 per month, and we'll probably have a class for tenants, and we'll say 4. Okay, so if I add these guys, okay, it's going to, of course, because they're positioned relatively, push them to the bottom, but we don't want them pushed to the bottom, so we definitely want to do dot home listing dot price position absolute and dot home listing dot tenants position absolute. Now let's see what that does. Again, it kind of pushes them, first of all, it pushes them against each other because they're positioned absolutely and outside of the thumbnail, and there's not really a clear, and it's pushed like after the image because we haven't really defined any coordinates where to be moved off from. But now we can do some interesting things. So we can define not only how many units to be away from the top, we can also say how many units should it be away from the bottom, left, or right. So if I want the price to be right on the left side and at the bottom left corner, I want to set the left to be 0 and the bottom to be 0. Conversely, I'd want the tenants to be on the bottom right. So let's see what kind of magic that happens. Cool. We don't see it very well, I don't think, because of the gray color. So I think what we want is we want to make the color to be white. Very neat stuff. So now we have some white stuff going on, and because it's right at the edge of the container, which is actually the thumbnail, you can see it's kind of getting cut off right there. So we want to push it left a little bit, and the other one pushed right. So what we can do is we can actually do we can either do it here, so we can say maybe 5 units left, 5 units right. Let's see what kind of magic that does. Okay, seems to be not what we want. So another way that we could do it is we could actually do margin left 10 pixels and margin right 10 pixels. And that's more of our intended effect. Here's the $600, and then here's the 4 units. In fact, let's call that 4 units. 4 units. Cool. And there's our little Pinterest layout. To make it pop out a little bit more, we can add the text shadow property that we had on the header 1. And we might even want to increase the font size. So here's the 18 pixel font, just to kind of make it a little bit bigger. Font size, pixel. That's cool. That might be too big. It's too close to the too close to our title, so maybe 16 pixels is sufficient. And that's what I'm talking about. We're done here. Now, in setting up this system, we've pretty much created a problem where it's basically very redundant code. There's a lot of commonalities between how we, made the text pop out, what size text it is, and if we want to make adjustments in the future, it's going to be problematic because we're going to have to make it in multiple places. So we should make a more general class. Let's say we'll call it Descript text, and we'll add all the common elements there. It has to be positioned absolutely. It has to be of color white, and etc. Such that the unique content to price and to units should be left where it is, but then all the other stuff can be deleted so that if we make those adjustments, it's applied uniformly. Now, since we've added this new class, we have to go back to our Descript text, or we have to go back to our HTML and add the Descript text class to the elements. Nothing changes on the visual side, but there's a lot of value added for the programmer in order to keep that organized and to make that really easy to maintain. And so we've created this individual element. Let's first add it along the row side. Let's add the other the other three houses. So, oops, disaster has struck. I think I did it in the incorrect indentation level, right? I did it at the row level. We wanted to do it at the column level. This is where it gets a little bit problematic to copy and paste houses. Seems to still be a little bit too big. So let me just double check that I copied the CSS correctly. Here's one, and again, I made the silly mistake of copying it incorrectly, so we can fix that relatively quickly. Now let me just kind of make sure that all my divs are aligned. And again, this is a useful exercise because even though I'm making little mistakes, it's something for you to keep in mind, because if you see yourself making similar mistakes, you basically just have to look at your code, see, okay, well, are my opening tags and my closing tags matching up? Is my indentation level matching up in order to have the intended behavior that I expect, right? That's where it gets really, really key. In fact, it turns out that I wasn't even copying things properly. But now you can see I should have my 4 width columns, so if I refresh, it properly fits to the width of the associated container. So now that I have my rows, I can actually create multiple rows of houses, and that way I have my content. And those could be different images altogether, they could be totally assorted, but as you can see, here's my little Pinteresty collaborant house. And you can definitely mix it up however you want, but recognize again, this is just a piece of HTML code. I've just introduced the concept of position absolute, the concept of creating inherent mixed grid systems, and that's allowed us to create a complex grid layout that still looks compelling and unique for the user. We're going to do some work on creating an individual page, and then we're going to move on to some of the other pages as well.